So do we need a higher power to end our addiction? Well, the medical model, the conventional medical establishment would say no. It's addiction is a brain disease and you treat it with medication and therapy. But AA and the 12-step program would say, yes, you need a higher power. You're powerless without that. Carl Jung, the psychiatrist who inspired AA to adopt a higher power concept or understanding, he would say something completely different. And after 15 years of consciousness-based recovery that I've specialized in, and also 8 years of Jungian psychoanalysis and my own shadow work, I feel that I can offer a unique perspective on this debate as to whether you need a higher power or not. So today I'm going to show you 3 completely different answers to this question and why one of those that worked for me might actually change everything for you. So let's start off by looking at the conventional medical model. I mean, this model really looks at addiction as a brain disease, a chemical imbalance that is chronic, and it's basically where your reward pathways in your brain have been hijacked. Your dopamine system is dysregulated. And so because of that view of the problem, they would say that you use medication to regulate your brain chemistry. And you could use, let's say, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, to help modify your thinking and your behavior. Here, there's no mention of higher power or spirituality or consciousness. It's all about neuroscience and chemistry, and it's about behavior. So this approach, it does work, it does help people who are purely focused on a fairly physical and non, let's say, spiritual point of view. But effectively, it comes down to your own willpower, because the medication helps at some point, but there's a real limitation with that. The limitation is that something that the medical model can't explain, like why does somebody relapse after months, even years of abstinence, when surely their brain chemistry is normalized? So if it's all about brain chemistry, then why do people relapse? And also, why do some people have they just end their addiction spontaneously when they have a religious or spiritual experience, or let's call it a transcendent experience? It doesn't have to be religious. So really what the medical model does is effectively treats the symptom, which is either the behavior, let's say if it's gambling, or the substance. It treats the substance as the problem, and so you get the substance out of the system, rebalance brain chemistry, and then there should be no addiction. But we know this isn't the whole story, because people do relapse. So, but in that model, there is no room for consciousness or, mind transformation or transcendent or spiritual experiences. So let's move on now to the conventional perspective, or the 12-step program, which really advocates that you do need a higher power. I mean, the first step says that you need to admit that you're powerless and that you can't end your addiction by yourself with your own resources. And step number 2 would say that you need to believe in a power greater than yourself, in an external power that's transcendent to you. And then step 3 would say that you have to hand over your will to this external power. And obviously in a Christian sense, or in kind of a religious sense, that would be handing your will and your power over to God. So in this system, the higher power is essential. You can't do it alone. And basically the idea is that your, in a sense, humanity, your flawed nature, got you into this mess, into this addiction. You aren't able to get yourself out of the mess, because it's really only something more than you, or something outside of you, greater than you, that can fix this. And, this approach has worked for millions of people around the world. Obviously, it's a lot more than just handing your will over. I mean, that's only the first 3 steps. I mean, AA has an amazing inner work that occurs emotionally that's very, very healing if someone goes through that process. But the limitation here is that it still leaves you feeling that you're broken and that you're you have a disease for life, even after that healing work, you can never have another drink again. And, a lot of people are continually going to meetings or on a daily basis for their whole life or for many, many years. But let's look at, Carl Jung's role, the psychiatrist I mentioned before, who was actually a student of Freud's, but really took the idea of the unconscious and saw that it was in a much greater way than Freud ever did. Freud looked at the subconscious as more of a dumping ground for things that we kind of reject about ourselves, whereas Jung saw the unconscious as not just our personal unconscious, but he talked about levels of the unconscious that expanded to have like a familial unconscious, a cultural unconscious, and a collective unconscious that includes all of existence, really. So it's a much broader view of what we don't know, but what we, in a sense, are part of, and has the influence over us, or we have our life integrated with. But back to AA and Jung's influence there. This came from 1931 when Jung treated a patient who's named Roland H., to keep his privacy, who had alcoholism. And after some treatment and some abstinence, Roland relapsed. And Jung told him that basically the medical treatment would be useless for him, and that his only hope is a vital spiritual experience, a genuine, let's say, conversion that transformed his entire being. And Roland found that experience in the Oxford Group, a Christian movement, where he ended up becoming sober, staying sober. And he told his friend Ebby, and Ebby told Bill Wilson, Bill Wilson's the person that founded AA, and Bill Wilson then contacted Jung and eventually incorporated the idea of the need for a higher power into AA. But the critical part is that what Jung meant by higher power and what became, in a sense, part of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, were two very different ideas, and also very different experiences. See, the 12-step or AA basically conceptualizes a higher power as an external entity or an external higher power outside of us. This is because they also have this view that we, in our natural state, are powerless and flawed and broken. And it has to be something outside of us that's more than us, that's more perfect and more powerful, that can save us. This is almost a very Christian view that we need to be saved from, let's say, an outside, separate God. So for many people, this is something that really makes sense, and it really works for them, because, surrendering to a greater is a very powerful thing to do. And it allows you to lay down your own desires, your own cravings, and, in a sense, dig deeper to a deeper strength, a strength that you can perceive as be greater than yourself, that helps you then take the action that you need to take in transforming. So I think that can be very life-saving, and I think that is the benefit of AA. But for other people find this very limiting, especially, let's say, people who are over 40, who've been involved in their own inner work and their own personal transformation, that they find this idea of being powerless or accepting that we are powerless as something that doesn't really fit with an experience, let's say, in a transcendent experience that someone may have had. So for these people, they find this idea of accepting this limitation of being powerless, accepting this idea of being broken, doesn't resonate. So for those people, it would be, instead of being powerless, it would be feeling powerful. Instead of feeling, let's say, broken, it would be more of that we're just fragmented and unconscious. And rather than needing to be saved, it's more like growing and opening to becoming more whole. So this is, I think, closer to what Jung really meant. So let's go back to Jung and let's have a look at what he meant by this. So in 1961, Bill Wilson, the founder of AA, wrote to Carl Jung to ask him about the Roland case. And Jung's response, I think, is really, really important. Jung said his, referring to Roland, his cravings for alcohol were equivalent to, on a low level, a spiritual thirst for wholeness. It's like a thirst for wholeness is what Jung was saying. And he did go and it did say that in terms of medieval language, that this would be a union with God. But I don't think he was really necessarily saying that medieval language is necessarily the total way to think about it. Because if we read it again, Jung talks about, spiritus contra spiritum, which is the Latin term for, a spiritual experience against a spiritual problem. And the spiritual problem being the fragmented nature of the psyche, the lack of wholeness, and in a sense, the consciousness of the person. So in this sense, the cure for addiction isn't necessarily willpower or abstinence. It's more about spiritual awakening. It's not so much about a spiritual doctrine of an external entity. It's more about consciousness transformation. And I think that's more the more accurate depiction of what Jung thought. And we know this because Jung made a very clear distinction between spirituality and religion. So with religion, we're talking about a human-based institution that runs with, in a sense, of strict doctrines, like as in codified understanding of conceptual understanding of the way things they believe are, of an external authority being an external deity, God, and certain belief systems and very much rules-based. On the other hand, spirituality is more experiential. It's more personal. It's more of an internal knowing, a direct relationship with, let's say, a greater experience of wholeness that we are not separate from. So this would be more in line with what the mystics would talk about. So you've got two different views there. One of the spirituality, which I think is what Jung was really talking about, versus the external authority, the human-based institutional rules-based organization. So Jung said that an alcoholic needs a vital spiritual experience. He didn't necessarily say that you needed to attend any particular meetings or place or church or anything like that. And I'm not saying that that's not useful. And for some people, that is what they want to do and need and works. But I'm just talking about what Jung meant here. I think he meant a transformation of consciousness so profound that a person, in a sense, becomes a whole person, like more of their being opens up to conscious awareness, conscious access. So in a sense, the person that needed the addiction no longer is that same, that doesn't relate or behave or even perceive things in that a limited way, that fragmented way, because this transcendent transformation of consciousness has occurred. And Jung talked about, we know this is what Jung talked about because he coined the term the process of individuation. So individuation is becoming a whole person where what was conscious or subconscious becomes conscious and is integrated. And we know that Jung had a very clear understanding of this type of integration because he talked about shadow work. The shadow in Jung's thought is an archetype being a structure of the psyche, is an archetype where parts that we don't like about ourselves, things that we find, let's say, maybe shameful or embarrassing, we disapprove of them or society disapproves of them. These get pushed from the conscious mind into the subconscious, things that we deny about ourselves, things we don't want to face. So this is where but it's not as if they just disappear and are swept under the carpet. They're actually having an influence and cause automatic reactions in our present day conscious life, but we don't know where they come from. So Jung talks about this process of individuation being a process of opening up to what's subconscious, both the things we don't like about ourselves and more, more capabilities that we didn't know we had. Jung sees the shadow as the driver of addiction. And we know this to be true. If you have seen some of my other videos, you know, where I've talked very much about how the subconscious drives addiction, drives cravings. Even when the conscious mind doesn't want to have addiction, the subconscious takes over. And Jung would say that the shadow and what is contained within the shadow, within ourselves, the things we don't like about ourselves are, or the things, the wounds that are unhealed are, in a sense, pushing for addiction to occur. In a sense, to kind of create this low-level satisfaction. He called this low-level experience of wholeness. I mean, if you think about alcohol, it dulls you down, makes you forget about everything. And if everything kind of feels okay, but our world is much smaller in that state. So it's about, for Jung, individuation's about integrating rejected parts of ourselves. It's about transforming for our consciousness to be opened up. And in a sense, it transforms the way we view ourselves to more than a broken, separate, powerless being, to a much more whole, integrated, and surprisingly resilient and actually very okay, very safe state of being. So this is where the spiritual thirst ends. In other words, the addiction ends because you're no longer thirsty. You're satisfied, you're content. So for Jung, it's not about believing in an external God. It's about becoming whole. Now, that's not to say that Jung did not believe in a spiritual higher power. He did, but just didn't define it in that way, as in an external separate entity. And I mean, there are many mystics who would talk about, the immanent experience, the oneness with God. In fact, even Jesus said oneness with the Father. But this is very difficult to talk about, because when we say me, oneness, and Father, it's almost like we've created three separate things, when actually that experience is not separate. And if you've seen my last video, you will. I tried to describe an experience of that unity that can occur. The problem is actually our conceptual mind chopping it up, when we do experience this wholeness, there's no separateness. So, I actually had 8 years of Jungian psychoanalysis and myself, because at that time I was going through my own kind of crisis of my own lack, my feeling of lack. And I was, in a sense, externalizing that by trying to create a bigger than Ben-Hur business that ultimately crashed because I was overcompensating for my own inner lack. During that time, I became a workaholic. I was working, till 2 o'clock in the morning, many nights a week. And ultimately, it all crashed, and in the GFC in 2008, and destroyed my family and my whole life, really. And it's just an example of how addiction can really destroy your life, but also how the addiction at the root was actually coming from my own shadow. And the Jungian analysis helped me understand that. So let's look at the True Quit mind transformation method, and how that, all of my experience and understanding here is to kind of synthesize this question. So we've got, on the one hand, this idea that you don't need the medical model, you don't need a higher power. Then you've got AA saying you do need a higher power, and but that's more of an external higher power in the traditional AA sense. And then we've got Jung's understanding of individuation. So I would actually put all of these views on a continuum, and I would say that depending on your level of awareness is, in a sense, the level of connection that you would have with this question of higher power. So if you have no awareness of a kind of a limited awareness of ourselves and the deeper nature of what we are, we tend to view things as everything being materialistic, as in made up of material things. And it's basically, if it's just matter, and mind is a product of matter, being our brain, and the nerve cells in our brain. So everything is essentially material. And this is it becomes like it creates a mechanistic model, like as if we are essentially a material machine, that our brain works materially as a kind of a material biological machine, and chemistry describes how that works and physics describes how that works. Well, that is the medical model of addiction, in a sense, is the outcome of that paradigm, that understanding of the world. And this is why it doesn't see a need for any higher power at all. It doesn't go there. And so but then we've got AA that says, well, yes, we do need a higher power, but it's the higher power that's outside of ourselves. So this view is the view where somebody has a sense of something more than themselves, genuine, let's say, I don't know, inkling or intuition or kind of deeper knowing that there is something greater or more than what I perceive myself to be. So there's this greater level of awareness than the purely mechanistic model that doesn't believe in anything other than what you can see or measure. Well, this view of an external higher power does have a sense of something greater, something more, and that's a greater level of awareness. And for somebody that is their level of awareness, that is what they can work with and that what they can surrender to. But it's still, I would say, is limited in the sense of our potential awareness, because it leaves you with this view that you're broken and separate and powerless by yourself. And then if we come to Jung's view, which is, I think, a little more, let's say, mystical perhaps, but it's also, I think, a greater level of awareness, because anyone that's had any form of transcendent or mystical type experience will know that it's in that state the conceptual mind is not necessarily operating. You know, the mind that says me separate from other, or inside outside, or me separate from the world, or me separate from a higher power outside of me. This idea of outside and inside doesn't operate. There's a oneness. And so that's a greater level of awareness, and it's a more of an experiential understanding. You can't arrive at this level of understanding purely through logical thinking. Well, you might be able to through logical thinking, but it still remains conceptual unless you're experiencing it. And when you're experiencing it, the conceptual mind is taking a back seat. It's not, thought doesn't necessarily occur then. So that's why I say that these different points of view are really on a continuum, depending on your level of awareness. And I'm not saying that, any particular point of view is invalid at all. We don't know what we don't know at any point of awareness. So I'm just, in a sense, trying to make sense of these 3 points of view. And in doing it this way, seeing it on a continuum, we can see how, if you have a certain level of awareness, you would view that there is no higher power needed. Or if you have a certain view of awareness or a certain capacity of awareness, you would view that there is a higher power, but it would still remain separate. And if you had a more of an experiential understanding, wouldn't see that that the transcendent high power is necessarily excluded or outside of what we are. It's more that we have the potential to understand or experience that as one with what we are. I've described some of this in previous videos, and it's a big topic, obviously. But so in other words, how you approach addiction is going to really depend upon your level of awareness. And I think that Jung was right in the sense of wholeness is a great way to approach addiction. Now, you can approach addiction in the sense of accepting a transformation of consciousness and a wholeness without necessarily accepting the religious views of particular systems that you might disagree with. But you could also accept a transformation of consciousness and a wholeness, a personal growth into wholeness, as a way of ending addiction, even if you do have certain particular religious views. So that religious view really doesn't exclude a mind transformation approach. If you have had some, let's call it transcended or experiential spiritual experiences, well, in a sense, that just gives you more to work with in terms of what your understanding of transformation is. So I think this is a very, in a sense, personal pathway. Personally, my personal pathway is one of mind transformation, transformation of consciousness. In fact, transformation of the whole person, very much in line with the individuation process of Jung, but not exactly. Really looking at, in a sense, opening up to a state of being that is already whole, and in that process, what has in the past been unconscious or subconscious is able to come into consciousness and be resolved, and the deeper subconscious need for the addiction does dissipate. So, and I've described that process in other videos here, which I encourage you to look at. So basically, let's just summarize and say that if you need to approach things from a purely mechanical, material point of view, and you just want symptom management, and you believe that, you just want help with brain chemistry rebalancing or modification of behavior, then, and you're not interested in a spiritual or higher consciousness point of view, well, then the conventional medical model is probably the one that you'd more easily accept. But I do caution you if that is your only perspective, because it does leave you vulnerable to relapse, because if the driver of addiction is subconscious, it doesn't allow that to be resolved, that the subconscious root of the problem. And it also forces you to use willpower with that approach. And willpower means that you're going to have to keep using that because the mind keeps producing cravings. So, and if on the other hand, you have a more of a broader view, and you do feel like, you want to surrender and hand yourself over and accept this view of an external higher power, well then, and you want a community of, fellowship that resonates and works in that same way, then the AA model would be probably something that would be more acceptable to you. But I do caution you there that if you are going to follow the AA model, then you really would want to go through the full transformation process, the full process of all the steps that enable you to become more whole, have a permanent transformation and a permanent abstinence. But I do encourage you to grow further, look further, because I think that in my experience, you don't need to view yourself as powerless. Maybe you feel powerless in the beginning, but ultimately as a human being, I don't think we're powerless as human beings ultimately in our full, open, aware, whole state. But then obviously those of you who are more open to a consciousness-based recovery, where wholeness and transformation is very much something that you understand, and and if you are seeking deeper understanding, the other approaches don't make sense to you, then I would suggest that mind transformation and wholeness and integration, where what is subconscious becomes whole and conscious and transformed, I think that would work for you. So basically, if your understanding of addiction is that there is a deeper spiritual longing, a deeper spiritual hunger, you're seeking answers on a deeper level, and the transformation of consciousness through awareness is something that makes sense to you, then you might want to look into the True Quit mind transformation method. And so I really encourage you to, look at some of my other videos, and I'd love to hear your comments on which of these models resonates with you and which you believe is correct. And I really think that everyone's view is valid, and I would really love to engage in that conversation with you. So and of course, you can see my masterclass. There's a link in the description, and you can contact me if you wish to inquire or learn more about working together with me to end your addiction. So with that, we'll end this video, and I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.